Welcome to What's Your Baseline Shorts.
In this series, we're distilling down our usual long-form content from the What's Your Baseline podcast into a more concentrated and visual form.
Right, but most importantly, this is a brief, focused discussion about a key topic in architecture, process, business, change, and so much more.
One topic, one session, one take. That's What's Your Baseline Shorts.
My name is Roland Volt, and today I'm joined by my co-host, J.M. Merlinson.
Hey JM, how are you doing today?
Hey Roland, I'm excited to talk about our topic today for What's Your Baseline Shorts, which is all about what makes a good POC or POV. Now, first, I'm going to ask you, Roland, where do you see a POV fitting into a buying cycle for a customer for anything? What is the difference between POCs and POVs? Tell me all about them because I'm interested in your perspective.
I'm so glad that you asked because it's never good to start with some abbreviations. So, a POC is known as a proof of concept.
Yeah.
Typically a technical proof of concept. Does the thing do what it's supposed to do? While a POV is a proof of value. Do we get the thing out of whatever we're evaluating that we wanted to get out of it? Do we get the desired result?
Yeah, and a POC is often something you'll do as part of proving out that a technology actually works. Sort of like the trust but verify old thing.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing, is this vendor actually doing what they say they can do? Whereas a proof of value is way more involved because you need to actually take data, you need to actually get to an outcome, right?
Can your car really drive 160 miles an hour versus do I get faster to my grandmother?
Exactly. Although I think if you're going 160 to your grandmother's, something's very wrong. But so where do you see this fitting into the buying cycle? Because a lot of people ask about that kind of thing.
Yeah. So what you typically see is it depends on the type of software that you want to sell, right? Or it's in general what you want to sell.
Mm-hmm.
You typically see customers sending out what they call RFIs, requests for informations, which is the first step where they just go and say, hey, talk a little bit about what you're offering. We're looking for something that is this, but we still don't know exactly what we're looking for.
Yeah, it's kind of like a market scan from an analyst. We talked to Amar about that. It's kind of that idea. Tell us a little bit more about what you do. We're not committing to anything. No contracts on the table, no obligations. Just
that is true. Yeah, that is true. And then the next step would be an RFP, a request for proposal, right? And within that, the request for proposal, you will have different vendors, ideally being pre-selected, and they all get the same questionnaire because you want to do an evaluation. You want to compare apples with apples and not apples with oranges. And as part of that process, they might even make a decision after the RFP and say, yep, what you're selling, JM, is exactly what we want. Give it to us,
Sure.
And you go into the negotiation phase. But if it's a little bit more complex, if you sell business process management, enterprise architecture software, for example, people typically want to see a little bit more, right?
They do.
And this is where a POC or a POV comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
After that,
as a note for you, one of the things I talk a lot about is the difference between POCs and custom demos. They are very different. They do very different things. The biggest difference between a POC and custom demo is whether or not the person who's touching the keyboard comes from the customer or comes from the vendor. Oftentimes, POCs are things that the customers get their hands on. They work within to see how it actually goes and what's behind the curtain. A custom demo, you just send us data. We present something to you. You just trust that it wasn't that hard.
Which also means there might be a non-significant effort of training being involved in a POC or a POV, if you will.
It's true.
So after this, and we will talk about how a POC and POV typically would go, or ideally would go. After that, the customer goes into the big dark room, makes a big evaluation, and comes back with a list of vendors and says, okay, we're going to buy from JM. Let's go into the negotiation phase. Right. And then if JM says, oh, but I want to have an arm and a leg for it, they might say, no, thank you, JM. We're going to buy from somebody else. So it's the commercial agreement that you have in the regular enterprise software buying process.
Exactly. And the question is, why do you do a POC? Like, why do people do a POC for things, and why should you or should you not? So just as a note for everyone, I know there's been a trend I've seen in the work that I do, a lot of people asking, hey, let's just go straight to a POC. Let's go straight to a POC in the middle of the conversation around evaluation of products. And that's not necessary. A POC remember, it's an investment on
Mhm.
both sides, which means if you need to see the proof of how it works, or if you need to have people live it and experience it to gain consensus and buy-in and to sort of get pre-training for should you choose to move forward with it, you've had some experience with it, this is a great way to do so. But once again, it is an investment. And also, not all POCs are free. It's not just POVs that aren't free. POCs are often paid. A lot of organizations and consultancies require like some upfront cost.
Yeah, because it's a commitment that they bring to the table, right? Time and
Exactly.
effort and all these things. And we'll talk about that in a minute. You want to have the commitment from the client if you hit the objective of the POC that the client will buy, right? So they have more investment in there. But to come back to your point, do I need to have a POC in any buying process? The answer is no, right? If you, for example, sell a software that shall create a BPMN diagram,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you want to model your business architecture. Typically, you don't need a POC for this, right? A
What's it going to show
demo,
you?
maybe a custom demo, show us how you do this and how it looks and what systems you can or information you can bring in and all these things. Can I import Visio diagrams? Whatever the questions might be, that can be covered with a demo. POC or POV comes into place when you look for either something that is bleeding edge in
Yeah.
technology. I don't trust you, JM. I don't
Mm-hmm.
believe you that it actually works. Show me, right?
What is process mining? Oh, good. I don't even
Yeah,
know.
for
I've never
example.
heard of it. It's brand new. It's not that new, but
Or if you do a POV, it's like, hey, we want to know, to stick with your process mining example,
yeah.
we want to know if we see ideas how we can improve.
Mm-hmm.
And this, I think in this case, it makes sense to have a POV. But
Absolutely.
hey, when you get started with that and put yourself into a customer's shoes,
Sure.
what is the first thing that you would recommend a customer to do?
I mean, the thing I ask every customer to define right up front is objective and success criteria.
Hmm.
Like you need to know first and foremost what we talk about. Like you need to clearly spell out why are we doing this POC and what will make this POC successful for us. Because remember, my mom used to have an expression that I loved, which is that you can't think of people as clients and vendors. You think of people as partners. You're trying to build a partnership relationship. Both
Hmm.
both people are putting their their money and their people on the table. So let's have a clear objective and success criteria. And if we are successful, we should be moving to the process of purchase and sale and partnership. And to get that clear objective, you need to have hypotheses. You have to think, here's what we're going to be testing. Here's what we think it should. What should we do? What do I want to know? Particularly for things like POVs, you need to have hypotheses you are testing. All this
And
has to be defined. It has to
yeah,
be defined and written down
yeah, that's exactly the point. You want to have it written down, right?
and
So
agreed
that
upon.
yes, so that everybody looks at the same piece of paper when it comes to the evaluation and they say, did I check the box, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the second thing is, well, if you're on the vendor side, once you have the objectives, you can define what the scope is, right? You can
Yeah,
say,
of
oh,
course.
Mr. Client, we're going to build this for you, and we're going to build that for you. And does that meet your requirements? And you do that before you even start working on it, quote unquote.
Yeah, but then there's the structure from there. How do you build that structure into something that actually works? Like what do you do during the POC
Yeah,
or
yeah, and
POV?
there's obviously a lot of education on the way until then, which brings me
Yeah.
to the next point. What is the typical structure of a POC or a POV? And the first thing that comes to mind is have a clear timeline, have a
Hmm.
schedule, bring in those mechanical things like provisioning of environments, like
Hmm.
training people. What's the expectation of the client? Is it enough that you just point them to whatever a recording or a free training, or do they want to have a little bit of handholding as part of the POC, which obviously costs time, right? You also want to make sure when you set up your schedule that this is not open ended, right? You want to be done, say, in 4 weeks,
Yeah,
right?
time
So
box it.
you plan backwards from that last day, which typically is a final readout, right? Before the customer then goes into its currents and goes and evaluates all the different things that they've seen.
And that's to protect both parties. Like you don't
Sure.
want to be bleeding resources for 6 months on a POV that is just like, that's encapsulating all the time a department does. That's crazy. You're just investing in something you may not use. Same with
Hmm.
the vendors. Vendors don't want to lose their pre-sales and professional services people for large periods of time. They don't have a giant bench of folks they can allocate to a bunch of POCs. Those people are juggling lots of stuff. So we
Yeah.
protect it by time boxing it, and time boxing it up front allows us to build the structure around it. So now we have constraints, and constraints breed innovation.
Agreed,
So,
agreed. And what you typically do is then you start with a kickoff, right, with a brief. So you
mhm.
have a formal start and you have a formal end. And in that brief, and we're going to talk about that in a minute in a little bit more detail. In that brief, all the stuff that we just said will be restated for everyone to listen to. What are the
Mhm.
objectives? What's the evaluation? What's the timeline? What are the artifacts that will be created? And maybe more importantly, what's the collaboration between the two
Yeah,
parties? Because you
absolutely.
should avoid just throwing something over the fence. If we stick with that process mining example,
Yeah, yeah.
oh, here are my SAP tables. Now go make it happen. That's never
Oh,
good. So
good luck.
if you're a vendor and you have a client who approaches you in that way, say no.
Yeah,
Just don't get started with it.
not
What you
worth it.
want is you want to have a commitment from the client. And the
Mhm.
better POVs that I worked in, where we as a vendor went and said, look, we want to have a commitment from you. Say 40 hours in the next 4 weeks, right? And these are the resources. Who's your tech guy? Who's your business guy? Who's your blah, blah, blah. And the client agrees to it because then they're invested in it.
And they're also invested in the outcomes, right? And that's the thing we need to do. I want to make sure we cover this because you always need to have a big readout of the results of
Mhm.
your project, little POC POV. You need to bring different stakeholder groups in, segment your message by who's coming in to see it, and most importantly, build that coalition of people who understand what the product is doing, understand what the practice is around the product, understand the value or the concept that you're bringing to the company, and have a path forward to actually buy and use this as the core of what they do.
And that's another aspect for that contribution, right?
Mm,
It's you do not only buy a thing,
no.
right? You also want to test out, can I work with those people,
Yeah.
right? Will the vendor give me the support that I expect, or are they a little bit fishy or whatever? Where you
Hmm.
say, oh, I don't have a good feeling working with them. So that's, I think, also something that you want to make sure on both sides. You want to make sure that the personalities match. And
Yeah.
then at the end of that whole process, right, there's obviously then the negotiation phase,
The
right,
commercial
where
part. Yeah.
the technical team might say, okay, hey, we've shown you everything. I think we checked all the boxes, and now the sales guys come in and say, okay, what can we do, right? And this is a complete different topic for
Yeah.
another shorts if you want to, but that obviously can be the make or break deal breaker in here.
Hmm. And so we covered a good structure of here. Now, what are some best practices or lessons learned that you've taken? I mean, from me, I think one of my biggest lessons learned that I've taken is to always understand stakeholder needs, segment them down,
Mhm.
so you can very clearly define who needs what when. And that's like having a timetable that also includes people at each point in time, so that you can give them a sense when you're going to be needed. Help them allocate their time and resources, and ultimately make sure you're delivering what they actually ask for.
Yeah, and I think you can summarize that under the topic of communicate clearly.
Yeah.
Because what you also want is, like I said before, you want to have your clients involved. You want to have their participation in there.
Mhm.
You want to communicate to the stakeholders. If you're the evaluation committee, right? You want to give your stakeholders, the people holding the purse, also continuous feedback to say, oh, this is how it's going. We're working with that JM guy. He seems to be a knowledgeable and nice guy. I like working with him, right?
Mhm.
But you also want to make sure that, oh yeah, everything that we had on our list, they already accomplished that. Now we're drilling even further into whatever the data, right, to see what the tool can do above and beyond what we had as objectives.
And keeping that idea of communication, one thing I've really found helpful is having a knowledge repository of POC and POV artifacts, something you can access asynchronously. So if you're somebody at the client looking to try and make your case, and you can just go, oh, here's where I'm going to go and call up the latest presentation or demo. And if you're somebody at the vendor looking to prove your case, you can use this as a mechanism of giving best practices and reference documentation, quick reference guides, these sorts of things. Have a repository, use it.
Yeah, it's not Microsoft Outlook for those of you who are curious.
No. A real repository, something that's useful.
Yeah. So last thing, and we're getting at the top of our allocated time, JM, shorts. There's maybe when you look at it from a vendor side, right? I think the one takeaway that I would give to vendors is make it easy for the client to buy from you.
Yeah.
Right. And that means have a clear definition of the business problem.
Mm-hmm.
Clients don't want to buy just software, right? They have ideally for that POC a big hairy problem, right? That they want to tackle, and they said, "Hey, we need help with this. Can your software, can your services help us with that?"
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that is one thing. And when we talk about process mining, I have some ideas how that could look like, but have this definitely together. And the second thing that I have is when you frame the solution, do this also collaboratively with the client, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that they are invested in there and they see that you are people too.
Yeah. And then lastly, I think that the thing that I would urge to all vendors here is keep your pricing simple. Minimize the number of SKUs you've got. If you've got a billion stock keeping unit, a billion different ways of buying it, a billion different scenarios, that's just going to get in the way of helping to understand what you're actually providing to them, because you're providing a solution, and it's as simple as that. And the harder it is to buy, the harder it is for them to actually see what they're going to get.
Which, and I almost want to say I've never seen that, which is obviously a lie. But be consistent when you have your actual final list of SKUs, that the client is not confused. So whatever you put in there in your proposal, that should match your PowerPoint presentations, that should match the experience that they have during the POC, and so on and so forth. But having said that, JM,
this is a lot of fun. Yeah.
It was a pleasure talking 15 minutes with you about a POC and POV.
Friends.
But before we let you go, well, dear listeners, do you have some feedback for us? What were your experiences with POCs and POVs?
Mm-hmm.
Please let us know. You can always reach us at our website or email at hello@whatsyourbaseline.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can leave us a comment, right? And we're happy to pick this up and give you an answer. And with that, I'm Roland Volt.
And I'm J.M. Erlinson. And
we're
we
going to
will see you in the next one.
In the next one.